children naturally have agencies. I do think that traditional schools mostly damage or reduce the agency of children. And to give you a concrete example, 20 years ago, I created Montessori middle schools in the Bay Area, and half the students came up from the Montessori school and half were from public school. And no matter how bright and well-behaved the public school kids were, when we gave them an environment where they could pick what they wanted to work on that in the morning, for instance, the Montessori kids walked into the room, got right to work, knew how to manage their time. The other kids, it took a semester or a year to train them how to use their time responsibly.
How do people like us, with a drive to excel and a belief in our own agency, navigate life's complexities? How do we sift through the vast sea of knowledge to find actionable insights in areas like habits, health, wealth, and relationships? Come with me as I interview intellectuals and all-stars to refine life's ungoogleable lessons. I save you time and effort by finding the best of life's messy questions in this podcast to give you the answers. My name is Blake Bottrell, and this is the Distilled Podcast. My guest today has been liberating prisoners from bad education for over 3 decades. He attributes his love of learning to poor TV reception and the inability to play chess on a bumpy bus ride. A lover of the Socratic method, he is at the forefront of alternative education and giving people permission to leave the safety of the glorified babysitting system. Traditional education system. Michael Strong, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Blake. I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for the well-informed and appropriate introduction.
I wanted to start off with a case study of a 16-year-old student of yours who turned down an $140,000 job offer as an example of what happens when you let go of your limiting beliefs around education.
Well, absolutely. And thank you. I would say, many schools are focused on, the transmission of content. We're focused on helping students own their own education and own their own life. I want students to be responsible for their own education and their own life. And of course, we support and help them in many ways. The whole point of the Socratic discussion is to get them thinking about who they are and who they want to be. They spend at the Socratic experience hundreds of hours thinking and talking about ideas, but also who they are and who they want to be. And as a consequence, I think they do tend to develop a much bigger vision of themselves and where they can go. And for me, that's the ultimate education, is to have a vision for oneself and have the internal capacity to achieve it, or at least try.
I think a lot of the heart of whatever form of alternative education that we're looking at now, at the heart of that is this change from a what to learn to how to learn dynamic. And that's sort of the driving force that I see behind of a lot of the shift from traditional education into this sort of new frontier.
Big time. So I'm an autodidact and I want to develop autodidact. I can learn anything on my own for free. And I want to have high school students who can learn anything they want for free. So on the one hand, it is, confidence, learning how to learn. It's also developing a sense of purpose and direction. So, most of our parents, by the way, are entrepreneurs and creative professionals. And I think that's because if you're creating value in the real world, rather than jumping through hoops, you realize that's the priority for your child. And so I want young people to know that if they want to, learn math or physics or software development or poetry or French or Spanish or history, whatever, they can do it. And I think that there are tremendous rewards for people who are self-driven autodidacts, who craft a sense of direction for themselves and then know how to go about achieving it. So for me, this is the ultimate runaround, in a world of AI and robotics and so forth, is not to be dependent on what the external world offers, but crafting one's own path so that one can use the marvels of technology to deploy it in service of one's goals.
Are there any particular pieces of EdTech or educational technology that are rather niche that you're excited about that aren't the chat GPTs of the world?
No, that's a great question. So there's something called Asha.io that was originally developed for people to learn how to code in Kenya. And so it's designed to be a platform both for project management, but also learning. And we're looking at deploying it with our juniors and seniors expected to do creative and entrepreneurial projects. And in general, they're doing a good job. But going back to this notion of, in the real world, we typically benefit from project management tools and productivity tools. So we're also used getting things done. And we want our students to develop experience getting things done using these tools that adult professionals will use. And so really one way to look at it is, there are a lot of people in their 20s having a blast working for startups, working on creative projects, yada, yada, yada. We want our students to have that experience in a real world manner at the age of 15, 16, 17.
A lot of the heart of this conversation, again, is going to come back to this sort of idea of creating agency in students, and that being at the utmost importance of what a lot of these new education institutions or systems are trying to do. When you're looking at bringing a student from a traditional education setting into Socratic experience or any of these other agency-based systems, what are you looking at in terms of how do we adopt that integration of agency? Because for a child who's maybe, say, 10 to 12 years old, who hasn't had the autonomy to do all of these things in a traditional setting, I would imagine there is a significant dampening of that spirit sort of within them, and it would be hard to facilitate.
So a great question. And I want to back up a little bit by saying, when we have to create agency, it is some work, and I'll get into that. But first of all, children naturally have agency. So of course, I do think that traditional schools mostly damage or reduce the agency of children. And to give you a concrete example, 20 years ago, I created Montessori middle schools in the Bay Area, and half the students came up from the Montessori school, and half were from public school. And no matter how bright and well-behaved the public school kids were, when we gave them an environment where they could pick what they wanted to work on that in the morning, for instance, the Montessori kids walked into the room, got right to work, knew how to manage their time. The other kids, it took a semester or a year to train them how to use their time responsibly. And that is that I'm a big fan of John Taylor Gatto, New York State Teacher of the Year, 7-lesson school teacher. Basically, standard education trains people to be passive and dependent. And some people are undamaged, but a lot of people are damaged. And I actively regard it as damage. And so a lot of it is getting them inspired. One thing about the Socratic dialogue, it's a group discussion, we online 15-to-1, is we provide them with topics and readings to read. And so we ask questions, and a lot of kids are ready to engage intellectually, and that gives them time to kind of explore the ideas in their own mind. And that's easier typically to provide some structure so they're not just trying to figure things out on their own. Similarly, we have students set their own math goals, and the default math goal is to cover 1 year of math per year, which that's what everybody does, so not a big deal. And some students are stuck there, but other students see, wow, I could do more than 1 year of math. Why not a year and a half or 2 years of math? And so there's a sort of organic process where, in the Socratic experience, a good number of our students are from Montessori or Acton academies or homeschooled. So we get a lot of kids who already still have their agency preserved. But the ones that are coming in, again, a few are already there. Some of the ones that come in because they're already working on an entrepreneurial or creative project or an intellectual. They're already doing amazing things, and they come to us because they want the freedom and support to do amazing things. But the ones who are a little bit lost, perhaps, and we have marketed our school along the lines of, does your child hate school? I'm all in with the kids who hate school. But some of those kids, it can take a little while to figure things out. So we start with these other elements. I would say student emulation is another big piece of it. We have a showcase twice a year where students submit short videos of their entrepreneurial and creative project. And just seeing their peers do amazing things ups their game. If their mental model was do whatever it takes to get the grade that I want, and that's it, it's a very different world where they have students writing books, working on building companies, getting paid to do software, whatever it is. And so I would say that combination of the Socratic inquiry, the self-paced work, we do have mentors. Every child has a mentor, meet with them one-on-one every 2 weeks for half an hour. The mentorship's very important. We have personal growth, where we talk about how to set goals, how do you learn from your mistakes. We have kind of an integrated system which provides the structure to help students who don't yet have agency gradually to develop it. And of course, the good thing is once they realize they can have agency, most of them are really, really excited about it because life is so much more joyful when one is pursuing one's own goals, joyful and meaningful, than being told what to do all day.
I want to come back to that math thing for a second, because I've heard you talk about something surrounding this idea of the self-paced math learning. And I want to cover the question as, why is it not hyperbole to make the statement that we're killing some kids by teaching them math?
So, first of all, I think one of the most important things is to have kids be confident and joyful when possible in what they do, but certainly confident. And there are some math kids who just love math and race through it. There are other kids their confidence is damaged by the math. And a lot of this is sometimes it's a bad math teacher, bad math textbook, whatever. Sometimes it's just not the right fit. One of the reasons I'm a big believer in individualized math is kids learn math at such different paces, and kids have interest in math at different paces. And I've seen kids who do very little math and then develop an interest and do a lot of math. Also, of course, they need to develop fluency in, for instance, the times tables. But if they didn't really understand fractions or decimals and they keep going, then they can get stuck and math's no fun. So one thing about having a highly personalized math program is it's about, in the long run, let's figure out how much math is reasonable as a goal. And frankly, a lot of kids don't need that much math. So, if you're going into STEM, the more math, the better. Let's race. But, I've got a lot of creatives where they don't see much need for math. And the case I make is finance. You'll want personal finance, and basically you want to be able to run your own business, ad agency or whatever. So let's get to the point where you can understand finance. That certainly requires decimals, fractions, basic Excel, fluency. But that's not learning algebra 2. So part of what we do is we have honest conversations about what are your destinations and what do you really need? And we don't lie to them about what they really need. There are things like the SAT. If you want to go to certain colleges, doing well on the SAT is important. If that's a goal, let's do it. If not, don't. And so we're very, very pragmatic about setting math goals. We give the student a lot of freedom. Sometimes there are tensions between family and student, but we convene family, student, and guide in terms of what are realistic math goals. And we work towards getting a commitment from the student in terms of, how much math at what pace and what type of math in order to have a career you love. So I think that personalization helps a lot. And I would say a lot of the fans of my work are adult creatives who themselves felt badgered and bullied and damaged by, a certain kind of approach to math. And they find it so liberating and refreshing that we're so personalized. We don't want to shame. I mean, put differently, I think a lot of kids experience school as being humiliated every day. And, even when we get into things like teen dysfunction and substance abuse and so forth. Now, I was a straight A student, school is easy for me, but I almost have a bad conscience because those of us for whom school was easy often then go on to impose these curricula onto other students with no idea that de facto it's daily humiliation that causes lifelong damage for millions of kids.
Yeah, I've heard you talk about the almost self-selection mechanism. And I had the same experience in school. I was the trope of the kid who had no problem skating through, but had no real ambition or motivation to do anything other than what got me an 85% so I could get the grades to get into university. But it's interesting that it's hard to do the necessary game theoretics to end up in the position of the child that has such a terrible time when we maybe didn't have the greatest time, or we weren't the jock who won all the awards or whatever, or literally won every single math contest or something like that. But for those of us sort of in that messy middle where maybe it wasn't that bad, so we could understand how everybody else could just go along with what's happening, we need to do a better job of pushing back and understanding that there is that subset of kids who, looking back on it now, I can tell you exactly the names of the kids that were in my class who fall into that category. And no small percentage of them have actually died since I graduated high school. So it's crazy that that's where we end up.
Big time. And I appreciate the fact you recognize how damaging it is, in part because, there's this whole debate about homeschooling, unschooling, public school, school choice, all of these debates. And most academic education professors and most education policy wonks are very much about standards and every student has to do this and all that. And one of my campaigns is I don't want any standards imposed on, say, educational scholarship accounts, ESA, because for me, it's a matter of which child will die. And it sounds hyperbolic, but literally for me as well. I've known students who did not regard themselves as smart. They may have had learning differences and they were literally suicidal. They transferred to one of my schools. We allowed them to do math at their own pace. In some cases, they took a year off from math because they needed to recover. Meanwhile, if they were good at, say, animation or video production or some creative thing, they could become a rock star doing amazing work. The transformation from being perceived in their own mind as the dumbest kid in their class, a failure to the family. And this is, these are sometimes families with plenty of money for therapists. These kids are in wealthy school districts with all sorts of special ed resources. I'm like, these special ed resources are basically telling you you're an idiot every day. And I know the people behind it don't intend that. But if a district or an educational program is forced to march every kid through the same curriculum, and for whatever reason, that's not the right thing for that kid, you're setting that up kid for potential depression, anxiety, suicide, and some of them will die. And for me, that's a certain.
Talk to me about how a wearable that tracks student physiology could be a killer for traditional schooling.
Yeah. So I'm in touch with a company called Immersion Neuro, and they measure through heart rate variability engagement. The founder, Paul Zak, is a neuroscientist, and for decades, he's been looking at, what part of the brain is active and what the correlates are with respect to heart rate variability. And one of the reasons I became interested in using his product, Immersion Neuro, is that when I spent years going into public schools and doing Socratic demos, and I would see these kids who are so bored and listless. A couple of data points here. 75% of high school students in the US are unhappy at school. That's a Yale study. 2/3 are disengaged with learning. That's Gallup. And I saw it. I've seen hundreds of classrooms where the kids are tuned out, bored, disengaged, unhappy. If you're not in kind of the gifted track, or the college, bound track, that's what most students are. They're just tuned out, bored, hate it. And, by means of Socratic dialogue, going and asking questions, having a provocative conversation, the kids become alive. And I thought, how can I measure this coming alive? And so when I came across Paul Zak's technology, I thought, we need to make it get physiological evidence of just how tuned out these kids are. And I've told people these data points from Yale and Gallup about 75% unhappy, 2/3 disengaged. People say, kids just complain. Well, Paul Zak has evidence that he can predict depression, clinical depression, a couple of days in advance because we start to withdraw emotionally before we experience depression. And, I want every parent to realize exactly how their child is doing. And I think elementary school is not necessarily that bad, but I think large public middle schools are a catastrophe for most kids most of the time. And I think if parents realized just how miserable, just how unhappy, how psychologically unsafe their child was in real time, the vision I have is just like most parents now have a camera in their baby's crib to see if their child is, unhappy or something's going wrong. I want parents to be monitoring their child's well-being and pull them out or do something and take urgent action if they're not well. One other data point, it's well established now that on Mondays during the school year, teens commit suicide at almost double the rate that they do during vacation. And I see this as a catastrophe as big as, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, which managed to change the whole narrative and behavior around driving while drunk. I think that we need to realize school is actively a dangerous place for millions of kids. And if parents could see this in real time with Immersion Neuro and they have alternative places to send their kids, I think that all of those classrooms where the kids are bored and happy, Lord of the Flies. The other thing is, of course, the behavior bullying. Bullying is much worse if all the kids are bored and happy than if they are engaged in meaningful work and proud of what they're doing. So I see this as a way to provide hard evidence for all those people who think, oh, kids are just complaining. They have no idea.
A lot of people's argument is that this started around 2008 to 2012 with the introduction of smartphones. And I read an article that you wrote back in 2019 that talked about the near perfect correlation between young male suicide rates and the enrollment rates in public high schools. So this is a problem that's been going on since long before the introduction of the smartphone. And of course, we can not attribute all of this. Correlation is never causation, but there is evidence there to suggest that this has been going on long before 2012 as a problem.
Big time. And I think this is a very important point. I completely agree with Jonathan Haidt and Jane Twenge that the social media has been harmful for kids. I'm not disagreeing with that, but what they and almost nobody else focuses on is, right, the incredible increase in teen suicide, something like 300% from 1950 to 1990. I mean, it then dipped, I think, due to the SSRIs in the 1990s, and then it started increasing in the early aughts. Then it's accelerated in recent years. Even as bad as it is right now, it's still not as bad as it was in the early 1990s. So the way I see it is people need, my whole recipe for mental illness is people need community, connection, meaning, and purpose. And if we're connected, so why evolutionary psychology is big for me. We evolved in tribes where we would be very connected to others and everything we did was meaningful. And so when you see kids in many cases pulled out of the workforce, and I think especially as you have the least academic kids now being forced into education, a majority of students began going to high school in the 30s, and a majority started graduating from high school in the late 40s, early 50s. I think it's not a coincidence. That's when you get the trope rebel without a cause and juvenile delinquents and all of that. In the 19th century, when kids were working, you don't have kids doing all the stuff they do now. I think we infantilize kids, and as a consequence of that infantilization, they do bad things. One other piece, Rat Park is a famous experiment where they got rats addicted to cocaine in cages, and then they gave them access to this park, and they started running around the park and lost interest in cocaine. Hello. If you have a meaningful natural life, we're all much less likely to be prone to anxiety, depression, and or addictive behaviors. So I think part of my whole thing with evolutionary psychology is human beings have certain needs. They need to be achieving in a meaningful way in a meaningful community. And school takes that away from most students most of the time. Again, the most academic students are getting their egos stroked by means of wins. I liked getting A's all the time. I liked being the first kid to put his hand up in class. All that was fun. Yeah, and I just didn't realize the damage it's doing to 2/3 of the class.
The other side of this that we haven't necessarily touched on, but is important, is that there is a large bureaucracy involved in keeping things the way that they are. And I think you getting fired from the school you built into a top 50 high school in the US for not having teaching credentials is the perfect microcosm of educational bureaucracy.
Absolutely. And sadly, many people, I went to public schools. Most of my family is public school. I come from the lower working class, so I get the affection for public schools. But what people don't realize is it has become a bureaucratic nightmare. So to give you a couple of other data points, in 1920, there were about 200,000 school districts in the US, and the one-room schoolhouse was a reality. Most districts were very small and very local and very responsive. I've read accounts of people who became famous entrepreneurs showing up at school, doing a year's worth of high school in 1 year and graduating. There's no way you could do that at the vast majority of public high school. You have to get the credits and it has to be certified and yada, yada, yada. It's a whole bureaucratic. By 1970, due to school consolidation in the 20th century, there were only 20,000 school districts. There were increasing these large, monstrous things. Today, there's high schools, public high schools with 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 students. And it's just a monstrosity. And right, then the bureaucracy, there are union rules, there are federal rules, there are state rules, there's a district. When I did my charter school in New Mexico you're referring to, that was the 36th best public high school in the US at the time, in a way, I had to work for the charter school board, plus the local school district, plus the state department of education, plus the federal government. And they had all these conflicting rules, and it was very bureaucratic. At one point, we got dinged on our audit because we had too many files in a file folder. These things, bureaucracies work for their own benefit. And if people haven't seen Yes Minister, the British TV comedy from the 70s and 80s, sadly, that's how bureaucracies work. And again, they're not bad people. There are heroic people in the system that are trying to do the right thing despite it. But as you have layers and layers of control and regulation, there was a famous inventor, I'm forgetting his name, it'll come to me, who wanted to innovate in the schools, Lego logos. Seymour Papert, that was his name, famous MIT AI researcher. And he said that reformers try to reform the school, but instead school changes the reform. It is, you have to fit into the boxes, fit into the grammar of schooling. This is third grade, this is seventh grade, this is math, this is social studies, this is the textbook, this is the assessment. To allow somebody to pursue their own interests is fundamentally at odds with the entire structure of schooling. It doesn't fit into the grammar of schooling. And so that means all these well-intentioned people. Somebody once joked that a teacher of the year is a person that would normally get fired. They're so incredible they got around the rules. But teachers of the year, the most amazing teachers, are often ones who break the rules and are, from a certain sense, irresponsible vis-a-vis the bureaucracy.
It's funny. I heard a stat from a gentleman named Malcolm Collins, who I had on the podcast previously, and it was around Zuckerberg's donation to the Newark, New Jersey public school system. And he donated $100 million. And of that $100 million, 31%, $31 million had to go to the union as basically a bribe to allow them to implement like measures that would track teacher performance or something like that.
Yeah, no, it's sadly, again, I think at this point, I regard it as hopeless. A couple of other data points. In the late 80s, early 90s, there was a $500 million gift under Ted Sizer Coalition of Essential Schools. And I loved what they did. I was at a school that was part of this. But I also realized it would not have any lasting change. It might change things a little bit. But then again, bureaucracies revert back to the incentive structure of the bureaucracy. And you can't use money to try to change that. Different example, I knew somebody who was managing the largest private philanthropic gift to a public high school in the late 1990s. It was Timken High School from the Timken Ball Bearing Foundation. He left before the grant monies were spent because he realized, no matter how much money he spent, he couldn't change what was going on there. Again, it's a hard thing for people who love public schools to hear. But when you get into, the money they spend at this point, New York City schools are approaching $40,000 per pupil per year. I like to get people to think, okay, if you had a 10-student micro school and you could get them money directly, you'd have $400,000 to educate 10 students per year. And I think you could probably rent a little facility and pay yourself decently, have internet connection and all that for $400K, and pay yourself way better than if you were a teacher in the public school. So much money is wasted, and sadly, putting more money in just is not going to change it.
We've sort of set the stakes here with the first half of this conversation. Have you read Abigail Shrier's new book, Bad Therapy?
I've not. I've read reviews of it.
How do we give agency back to parents who have been beaten over the head by education experts for the last 30 years that they don't know what's best for their child? The expert does.
That's a good question. So first, of course, kudos to the homeschooling movement because they've piloted a lot of these things, more recently the alternative school and micro school movement. So I live in a world where being outside the system is normal, and I've got great community. As there are large social media communities that are basically outside the system who rejected the system. The ESA legislation that's passed in the recent years with Arizona last year, giving access to all 1.1 million families to $7,500 per pupil so they can homeschool their kid if they want. They can send them to TSC if they want. They can microschool, whatever. Huge flexibility. Since then, 20 million students have gained access to ESAs. When Texas goes, and it'll be 25 million students. So we're at this place where, on the one hand, funding is becoming available for millions of students, and then it's becoming more normalized. I live in Austin, which is probably the leading location in terms of alternative education. We've got a vibrant homeschooling community, both Christian and kind of hippie homeschooling. Probably has more alternative schools than anywhere else. Most people in Austin know somebody who is educating their child in a non-traditional way. So it's becoming normalized. Part of this too is a lot of the EdTech leaders are saying to hell with normal school. Elon Musk famously started his own alt school. There are rumors he's starting another one. I know 4 or 5 other billionaires here in Austin who are starting their own little alternative schools because they've rejected the system. It really is becoming normal in Austin. And I think as more people know more people that have done things, I've interviewed a lot of people, as you have done, who have actually done it differently. I think there's this mental mindset, and the system tries to tell you your kid needs to go to school. I was delighted when my son, 20 some years ago, dropped out of high school because I gave him credit. He knew it was bullshit at the time. Now he's a, data scientist at Amazon, optimizing the largest server farm in the world, has a fabulous life. There are so many students who have had fabulous lives without trad schooling that those of us who've been in this world can point to endless examples. We just need to keep pounding this is a normal. I want to get to the point where people are kind of embarrassed when they still send their kids to regular school. Right now, outside of Austin, they're still kind of, oh, this is weird. When flip it around, oh, you still send your kids to that? I'm so sorry. It's that social pressure. Ultimately, it's that social pressure, like, oh, sorry. And that people will be nice about it, but I want people to be embarrassed about being in trad schooling.
Malcolm mentioned that same thing too. It's funny, the idea that eventually, just strictly based on deferential outcomes, that eventually people are going to be seen as neglectful for sending their kids to public school. And that when you have all of these other options, why would you not send them to do something else? It's funny how much people underestimate the shift in culture or mimetic force that comes with just having these conversations and normalizing things that are outside of what is, quote unquote, the norm. And that as the driving force to give people permission to explore alternatives.
Big time. And part of this, again, there are lots of people in education, at private schools as well. They believe in the system. They're sincere believers, and teachers, administrators, and so forth, that they literally believe that if you go outside the system, you're at risk. And of course, there are some unschooled kids who don't learn anything and have to catch up. And a few unschooled kids who, develop bad habits. I had one who was really addicted to video games, actually, too. But of course, conversely, what they don't think about is there are lots of kids in public schools addicted to video games, lots of kids in public schools who don't learn anything. And if you help, the way I see it is if your child is confident and has high-level reading, writing, and speaking skills, that's good enough for a wonderful life in many cases. If they also have daily math discipline, one place where I kind of disagree with unschoolers is I think it is good to develop a daily habit of mathematics, just because, math is the most, sequential, build upon it. And if they just do a little bit of math seriously every day, lots of different ways to do it. There are fun ways to do it, but I think a little bit of daily math, plus lots of reading, writing, intellectual dialogue, creative and entrepreneurial projects, then your kid is going to be fine. And if they love math, help them go into STEM, do more math. Again, it's trivial for, I would say, the top third of mathematical ability. It's trivial for those students to do 2 years of math per year. That's the other thing is, will they fall behind? Well, if they're mathy, easy for them to be way ahead. And if they're not mathy, maybe you shouldn't be forcing them to do more than just very basic grade level math and keep up. And that's enough.
To drive home this, there are kids in public school who aren't learning anything point. I saw a stat last week and then did some exploring, and it's from a little bit earlier, that the top percentile of third grade students have the same math ability as the bottom 50% of high school seniors. So they're in school for 9 years learning math and didn't accomplish 1 percentile better in scoring.
Absolutely. And you think about one of my favorite anecdotes. Mr. Beast hated school And at 12 or 13, he began optimizing for YouTube, optimizing both the creative and also the metrics. And yeah, now Mr. Beast's company worth $1 billion. He has an order of magnitude more followers than the New York Times. Mr. Beast's parents didn't let him drop out, but he basically started tuning out around then. And he would have been fine if he dropped out of school at 12 or 13. Back in the day, Ben Franklin, Thomas Edison, Andrew Carnegie all began their work lives at 12 or 13. I think all of these kids who are being forced to sit in desks when they hate learning and are not learning, when there are so many other paths that could energize them and help them set meaningful goals and allow them to develop skills. This is how the world should be. And I regard the imposition, going back to our earlier conversation, the imposition of compulsory mass schooling as responsible for a great deal of the mental health issues in the United States among teens and the substance abuse issue and bullying, violence, all of it. You cage the rats, they bite their tails off, or those of others.
Going back to this unschooling point and the divergence between unschooling kids who succeed and unschooling kids who don't, that is a function primarily of the home atmosphere. What's the message to parents who are overwhelmed by the idea of sufficiently fostering their child's individual genius?
That's a great question. So I wrote an article, How to Give Your Child an Expensive Private Education for $3,000 a year. It's basically homeschooling plus tutories. And $3,000, educated people are very cheap. A lot of college students would tutor for almost nothing. And if you can't afford that, very low income, get 2, 3, 4, 5 students together and you divide, you're paying somebody $20 an hour for tutoring and you have, 5 people in the tutoring group, it's $4 an hour. I think most families can afford $4 an hour and it doesn't, a couple of hours of math a week. It's not that hard. This is why I'm big on learning pods, micro schools. There was a time when there's either homeschooling and parents imagine being in the kitchen with a chalkboard or whatnot, or they're starting a private school. I need millions of dollars to do this. No, there's this incredible space in between where you get together with a few other parents and, maybe you trade. I know families where every mom watches the kids one day a week and the kids rotate houses and they get cool, different experiences each of the 5 days. There are ways for the vast majority of families to find a way how to do this. And, again, if there's a lack of academic confidence, hire a tutor. Online education, you can learn anything online for free. So if you have access to computers, there's always a public library. If you don't, go to the public library. Learning should be free, basically.
How do we sort of not kill this golden goose that we're creating and avoid the narcissism of small differences that comes with the slight differences between institutional models in the agency-based teaching world?
No, it's a great question. So, I love Montessori. I love Acton academies. I, love much about Sudbury and so forth. And I think we need to realize it's more important to have many of these models being tried and succeeding than, as you say, to quibble about the differences. The high-level message I have is the public health catastrophe caused by compulsory mass education is so huge that we need to work together to explore new options. Another thing is that if we're focused on the well-being of children rather than annual test scores, we can create more freedom of movement. And if we realize that kids, if they want to, can catch up, I think this is a big thing. Part of the anxiety towards annual testing is, oh no, they'll get behind. The whole thing of, oh no, they'll get behind is entirely from the system. I think if parents were not anxious about it, it's just not a big deal. I've seen kids who did no math at all until the age of 14 or 15 and then cruised through 4 years of math per year because the kid was motivated and eager. I think habits like focus, habits like confidence, attitudes like sense of purpose, those characters, again, I want parents to look, is my child flourishing or not? I think every parent knows more than the system about is their child flourishing or not. Let's focus on what you need to do to help your child flourish. And then, find these ecosystems, on Twitter or Facebook or wherever communities, online communities, which are full of parents and educators talking about different ways to do things. I think, I know a number of people trying to kind of aggregate these communities. I think that's the tough thing, is for people who are totally stuck in the system. How do they find these communities? And I'll give a shout out to, Hannah Frankman and Rebel Educator, because she's constantly on Twitter promoting different educational options. So one simple recipe I want to help people when I can is follow a Rebel Educator or Hannah Frankman to get a nonstop feed of investors like this.
I love Hannah. She agreed to come on the podcast in like November or December of last year, and is kind of a victim of her own success in a way, because I've followed up probably a handful of times and haven't gotten a response, because I'm sure she's just too busy killing it with what she's doing. But I look forward to having her on the podcast eventually. I think she's absolutely a force for what she's doing right now.
Absolutely. A couple of other resources. There's a YouTube channel called When School's Not Working, where I have some colleagues and I interviewed, maybe 40 or 50 people, many of them parents and students who had gone through alternative education and had successful lives. One of the reasons, again, I think this is valuable, is it's useful to actually realize there are real world examples. Another example, Caleb Capocha, his mom pulled him out of public school and he was in, I think, 2nd or 3rd grade because he was getting sick and felt miserable. He was completely homeschooled, became a professional actor as a teenager, did a couple of years of community college when he was 16, 17, got into Harvard. Now he's about to graduate next year with a CS degree in Harvard. You can have a great life. And by the way, he didn't do all these years of school. So he's among those children we interview. I interview my son Homer, as I say, dropped out of high school. Laura Deming is one of my favorite examples. When she was 6, she said, asked her dad, shouldn't I go to school? And he said, well, you can if you want, but I wouldn't if I were you. She was homeschooled, did 2 years, 2 hours of math every morning, 2 hours of piano, read books, and spent the rest of the day walking and talking with her dad. She got into MIT at 14, dropped out to become a Thiel Fellow at 16, and is now leading anti-aging VC in Silicon Valley in her 20s. So again, on and on and on. So many people have had great lives without the system. People need to find us, our community, and learn about what path is right for them or their child.
How much of everything that we've talked about today comes back to reading as a keystone habit?
I'm very big on reading. Again, I have known people that have had great lives without reading, or certainly in this day, especially of dyslexics, audiobooks provide a path. And so I think the habit of intellectual engagement is the real habit. And so if your child is not a reader, if you can get them to be into audiobooks. But when I find a child who's a reader, I think the educational task is about 80% done. High school biology, you need to be a reader, sociology, economics, the old thing, reading, writing, math are the core skills. I was a voracious reader. I was reading a 200-page book every night by the age of 10. And so that's part of being an autodidact, is now I read difficult research articles in the evenings for fun, to relax. And I think much of which people think must be acquired through schooling can be acquired through reading or audiobooks, or if people are judicious, there are a lot of educational content on YouTube. So I'm big on curate the kind of content you're consuming. Now there's so many different venues for consuming content, but I encourage young people not to, consume content that's not going to be valuable to them somehow. Always be learning somehow, broadly construed. Doesn't have to be the curriculum, because the curriculum is usually horrible. Just history. I hated school history. I think school history textbooks are the most boring, meaningless things ever. I'm a voracious reader of history now. My son was unschooled for a year when he was in 4th grade. He read Larry Gonnick, History of the Cartoon History of the Universe, which is a fabulous, erudite cartoon history. And I've certainly learned more in 2 days of reading that than he would have in a whole year of this garbage, elementary school history textbook.
I'm the same way. The joke I always tell is that my wife laughs at me because I was at one point watching a 7-minute YouTube video on how the Japanese grow strawberries. And that is my relationship to always needing to learn something. But there's an important word in there that I don't want to gloss over, and that's the word difficult when it comes to pushing yourself to expand your knowledge. And I know that this is a large portion of your Socratic experience learning and reaches beyond that in saying you're reading difficult research articles for fun at night, how important is specifically reading difficult texts or approaching difficult to understand topics in not just an educational context, but more broadly as part of your holistic plan for life?
Well, first, I think doing something that's challenging oneself is always good. And so, of course, I have a lot of respect for people who challenge themselves physically, artistically, creatively. And this goes back to kind of the problem of being addicted to, say, social media or whatever it is online, is if you're passively consuming rather than actively creating, you're on the wrong side of things. And if you're not pushing yourself to improve all the time, you're not living a full life. And so I think that sense of self-actualization, fulfilling one's potential, the hero's journey, however you think or describe of it, I think going back to what we need to inculcate in kids, we need to inculcate in kids the sense of what are you going to do that's amazing. And so because not all kids are necessarily into the academic cognitive thing, I would rather have a child who is going to be a world-class athlete and maybe not do as much academics than a child who was not motivated to do anything but got through the K-12 curriculum. I've hired Olympic level athletes just because I know anybody who has the capacity to do that can accept challenge. They're willing to work. And so prior to academic goals, I went to establish this sense of how are you going to really push yourself to be amazing? And then within that, yeah, is it social? Maybe it's sales, maybe it's entrepreneurship. But on the academic side, then I'm very pragmatic. I'm kind of right on that boundary of, self-directed learning, but also mentors and coaches encouraging peak performance. And the way I look at it is I don't want to push a particular path to excellence on a student, but as their mentor, I want them to work towards a path of excellence. And many paths of excellence do benefit from high-level reading, writing, math skill. And so in some ways, part of being very direct with kids is if they really want to persuade me that they're going to be a rock star and don't need math, like, okay. And what if that doesn't happen? And what is plan B? And what if your lawyers and accountants are screwing you over? Might it be good to be able to read the legal contract and maybe be able to figure out the accounting if you need to on your own? And really, I think what I find is when we respect children, respect their desires, and we really are looking out for how to help them have an amazing life while respecting their preferences. In my experience, most kids are actually grateful. I think the reason there's so much pushback is if their only experience of adults, whether teachers or parents, is forcing them to do things they don't like, then it's actually hard. This goes back to the deschooling process. It's hard to elicit excellence from many of them because their first reaction is to push back. So first I want to establish trust. Hey, I'm here to help you have an amazing life. You tell me what kind of amazing life you want to have. Let's figure it out. I've got a little bit of knowledge on how hard it is to be a rock star, a professional football player, whatever. But let's just be realistic. But I'm all in. If you really want to make it as a, creative, great. How do we do it? Steve Martin says, be so amazing they can't ignore you, which I love that line as well. If you're going to be in a, creative or athletic field that's super competitive, you have to be amazing. So let's work on being absolutely amazing. And kids respect that.
Yeah, there's a quote that I have from you that's probably, I forget if it's the 12-year-old TED Talk, the 10-year-old TED Talk, or the 9-year-old TED Talk, but it was the least utilized resource on Earth is the fact that there are 7 billion people, of whom maybe 1% wake up every day as vibrant creators. And I think it's finding that area where you can be that genius or have that difficult pursuit that doesn't feel difficult for you and really doubling down on that aspect.
Yeah, well, John Taylor Gatto's book is famously called Dumbing Us Down, and I think most people would think of that as hyperbole. His theme is that public schools dumb us down. And I think dumb, not only in the cognitive sense, but dumb in terms of becoming, a passive loafer, I think. And I see, by the way, both social media and AI and all the electronic things as exacerbating that. If we're a driven creator, wow, access to the internet and AI is just going to give us amazing lives. If we're a passive consumer, game over. We're already screwed. And sadly, there are a lot of people that are being vegetables. They're basically plugged into the matrix and it's consuming the life out of them. Whereas those of us who wake up and live with a sense of purpose and destination, life is going to get better and better and better. And I think that's the real inequality, is the inequality between people with drive and purpose and confidence on the one hand and people that have accepted passivity and dependence on the other. It's the most brutal kind of inequality.
Do you have any sort of internal Socratic framework or dialogue or method that you go through to help you better articulate your own ideas?
Two things. One is I describe myself as a Platonist, love the truth, the good, and the beautiful, and everything I do is focused on pursuing the truth, the good, and the beautiful. And then, how is long and complex, but the goal is the destination is clear. The other thing is a description by Scott Buchanan, the founder of the St. John's College academic program, where it's great books and Socratic seminars, describes the Socratic process is if I know what I know and I know what I don't know, and I know the difference, then I know what I need to do to learn new material. And it's very simple, but I find whether I'm reading a difficult text or as an entrepreneur, finding blind spots, running this algorithm basically, okay, I know that part, don't know that part. Do I know this or not? I'm not sure. Let's go down another layer. That is constant refinement of the edge. It's sort of how I discover my edge, is really thinking about what I know, what I don't know, and what's in between, and then down another layer. What exactly is it that I don't know? What exactly do I need to learn to go to this next level? Yeah, I'm running that algorithm constantly.
Part of my favorite thing to do, and is part of why I started this podcast, is to have these Socratic type discussions with people that are a lot smarter than me. And I find it sometimes hard, and I don't know, I've had this conversation with my wife a handful of times, is I don't know if it's that my ability to articulate the question in such a way that brings something out of the guest is good enough, or whether sometimes it's the guest that doesn't feel comfortable in this framework of working out things that are maybe within their area of expertise, but that are more these Socratic type questions that have a bent where there's not a perfectly formed right and wrong answer. And I love just exploring these ideas in people's area of expertise that maybe don't have a right versus wrong answer. If you had to give me action items of how to improve that particular line of questioning or how to better facilitate these discussions, is there anything that you could point to or suggest that I start with?
I think you're doing fine. And I actually think it's very simple. I think honest curiosity, my wife has a company where she regards the core of everything to be love, curiosity, and empathy. And so, I care about people, I'm curious about them, and I'm empathetic. There's kind of a harsh Socratic that's trying to, prove people wrong and trick people and everything. I'm like, you've probably seen my Socratic conversations with Lana from the age of 4 up to the age of now 11 on YouTube. And, with 4-year-old, I'm curious, how does her mind work? I want to understand. So I would say what I'm attentive to, and I expect you are as well, is when there are contradictions or uncertainties or things that don't make sense, dissonances, what about that? I see the core of Socratic inquiry is mutual expectation of consistency and coherence. If I expect you have a consistent and coherent worldview, if it is nonsense to me, then wow, why does Blake believe this and blah? It's a nice way to ask it. Seems batshit crazy to me, but how does he believe this and that kind of thing? And that generates explanations because it turns out most people do have a way they think it makes sense in their head. So I think that kind of inquiry into what is the other person believing and why, done in a friendly way, generates endless, I would say, mutual delight. I think people who get into this, there is some people have a social resistance against being asked questions, and a lot of times we have to help them get through it. I've heard the St. John's program where for 4 years read classic texts from around the world is having your most sacred beliefs ripped to shreds for 4 years. I love it. But some people get freaked out. So I think once you get accustomed to the idea of having things being questioned and realized it's a mutually beneficial process and an enjoyable process, then it's fun for the rest of your life. That, you're already there, so keep having fun.
I have one final question that I like to ask all my guests, and that's, what's the last opinion or belief that you changed your mind about?
It's a really good question. I read about a lot of things all the time, and there has been something recently. There are various aspects of COVID that I'm honestly uncertain about. There are things about COVID that I'm sure the establishment is wrong. Other things, actually, something I really don't know about is exactly when and where, the vaccines have been beneficial and when not. I think there are plausible cases that in some situations they were not, and other cases where they are. And it's one of those rabbit holes I haven't gone, did we really have to give young people vaccines and close the schools? Probably not. Probably a good idea to give older people vaccines? Probably so. But in between those two pools, I'm very open to kind of new data, new evidence, and the whole mRNA thing. Not sure exactly what parts of that are legit, what parts are not. There are all sorts of things where I would say I'm pretty good about just holding judgment. I've been down so many different rabbit holes, and sometimes the skeptic's right, sometimes the establishment is right. And ideally, we keep our minds open and receive new information and be happy. This is where civil dialogue is important. I'm always suspicious when people are aggressive about enforcing an opinion. Whereas if people are open on either side, there's this evidence and that evidence, then let's figure it out together and let's see how we all evaluate the evidence. So that's my kind of roundabout way of lots to still figure out.
Good ideas don't require force.
Exactly. And it's a red flag if somebody's, shoving them down our throats.
Michael, I love it. I love all your work. I was super ecstatic you responded to my email to come on the podcast. If we want to send people to find all your stuff, where should they go?
Our school, the Socratic Experience, is www.socraticexperience.com. I have a YouTube channel, Socratic Michael Strong, with videos of me, mostly leading Socratic dialogues with Alana, who's now almost 12. Follow me at Flow Idealism on Twitter, where I'm quite active. I'm also on LinkedIn and Facebook, but those platforms tend to be less fun. I'm on Substack, Michael Strong at Substack. Michael Strong is Entrepreneurial Solutions. So that's for the long, more intellectual pieces. On Medium, but I've left Medium because Substack's the new thing. So if you find me at Twitter, Substack, and YouTube, that's kind of the greatest hits. Feel free to get in touch. I am absolutely passionate about all of this. And if I can help anybody with liberating their kids or other kids from the damage of schooling, I'm all in. I'm here to help you.
Perfect. Thanks, Michael. I appreciate it.
Thank you.